Looking at my nose. So forgive me in advance. Again, welcome to this conversation on discourse and the power of language. So this is a really robust topic with a number of theoretical underpinnings and ideas behind it. And we only have an hour together, and we want most of it to be discussion. So we won't cover everything, nor do Jennifer and I know all the answers. And we can't provide you with a list of things to say or a list of things you can't say, so to speak. But our aim today is to give you some of those theories that inform this work, and also some tools that you can use moving forward. But I hope we can use each other as resources. So we're going to talk at you for 30 minutes while you eat your food, and then we'll open up for discussion. I'll pause the recording for discussion so we can have a great conversation. All right. So we're going to kick it off with a little question. I can ask if you like, but the first is, or do you want to do it, Jennifer?
I can ask the question. So when I start our first year writing classes, beginning of fall term, first week, a question that I like to ask that you can think about, we won't ask you for your answers, but you can sort of think about this, is how many languages do you speak? And we'll come back to that a little later.
Right. That's a big question. All right, so a quick little overview of some of the concepts we're talking about. The first is the idea of culture, and in particularly the idea of the dominant culture. In our world, there is a dominant culture, and that is one that has established its own norms, values, and preferences as the standard for the entire group. These norms, values, and preferences as the standard are structured so that the dominant culture can maintain their power. And they maintain their power through various ways, but mainly various ways of oppressing those who are not in the dominant culture. Sometimes I call them historical power culture outsiders. But the dominant culture uses those norms and values to maintain their supremacy over the historic power culture outsiders. There's a lot more there. We'll start there for now. Discourse, as this presentation is titled, includes those ideas and the written expressions and the theoretical foundations and the language of the dominant culture. This comes from Foucault. So when we say discourse, we don't just mean the words we use, but we're talking about a group of statements which provide the language for talking about a particular topic in a particular historic moment. So discourses is not only what we say, but also what we don't say. So, how we learn what's underneath that so-called cultural iceberg that I'm sure you've all seen. So these are implanted within networks of social and political control, which functions to legitimize what can be said, who has the authority to speak and be heard, and what is authorized as true or the truth. Knowledge in this case is linked to power. So it not only assumes the authority of the quote unquote truth, but has the power to make itself true. So all knowledge once applied in the real world has the effects of becoming true. And it's knowledge once used as to regulate the conduct of others, entails constraint, regulation, discipline, and practice. So those are those rules, norms, and preferences that press the marginalized class. But in this case, in this construction, there's no power relations without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose or constitute at the same time power relations. So what does this mean is that, the idea of knowledge and what we know to be true is only is only a case because we have a discourse to understand it. That discourse, however, is informed by the dominant culture. So the production of knowledge and what we know to be true is always crossed with questions of power. And I think Foucault's best example is the concept of madness in his time, that there were industries or power structures that were brought up that defined what it was to be mad in order to institutionalize those that were constructed as mad. Prior to that sort of construction of constructing madness as an other, there was no such discourse for talking about quote unquote madness. That's his Foucaultian 60s example. Let's get into this a little bit more relevant to what we're talking about here. So when we talk about discourse and power, we have to understand that discourses or the language we use, what we say, we don't say, it's not neutral or objective or fixed. Again, it's the norms, values, and preferences of the dominant culture. And it evolves over time, which I'll get into. It's also a way in which we construct our reality. It helps give us meaning to our world experiences and our perceptions. So we need discourses in order to construct meaning in our world. This also includes the myths, the narratives and explanations, words and concepts, and the ideologies that we have. So for example, we have a discourse of the hero will come save us, and that is perpetuated in myths and storytellings and religious texts over time. That discourse around a singular hero coming to save us has led to a construction of individualism, and that one person can save us all. That is not necessarily true. That has been formed through culture and history and time. That gets to culture. So these discourses and language are influenced by our culture. It's not universally shared. So that means when you were socialized, when you were grew up, when you were a little bitty baby going through school with your parents, whoever they were helping you socialize into the language you use to discuss your reality. But your experience is not universal. So even though it feels like to us, what we learned and grew up is what is true, that's dominated by our cultural socialization, and it's not universally true for others. So, but this also means the preferences and norms of the dominant culture are imposed upon us regardless of whether or not they contradict what's usual for members of the group, right? So, when we talk about discourses and language, the dominant culture might have rules or preferences that are not widely shared by the majority of people. So think about certain terminology we use, words that we bring into conversation. They may not be the norms and preferences or values that we might see in, for example, academia, which I know Dr. Martin will get into. It's bound in place and space. So power and knowledge are always rooted in particular contexts and histories. So meaning that's dependent on the historical and social movement in which it's used. So the example that one of the sources gives is the term colorblindness as a means to end racism. That concept is a discourse that would not have made sense but for the civil rights movement. So that historical moment created this discourse around colorblindness connected to a way to end racism. It shapes how we think, how we view, think about, interact one another in relationships to power. So all of these, all of these discourses helps us interact with power, but it's also reinforced and dominated within ourselves. There's a what does it mean kind of thing. The dominant group's discourses about minoritized groups will always reflect the dominant group's interest. What does that mean? That means our meaning-making framework is reinforced by the dominant culture norms. The messages, the discourses, the way we construct reality around minoritized groups is always going to be constructed by and in service of the dominant culture, if it is accepted to be true and part of that dominant culture norms, rules, and values. Once it's socialized, these existing hierarchies are seen as natural and not political. And when I say political, I mean in terms of power. So the idea that these discourses around how we talk about minoritized populations has a political purpose in order to reinforce that power. That power, that political purpose is socialized in us in that we don't see that as a political purpose. And it's socialized in us that we reinforce it in itself. That's the hegemonic aspect of these dominant discourses. The hegemony is that the dominant culture no longer has to enact oppression on us. We do it to each other. So no matter what group we fall into or what culture we fall into, we still maintain and police other people around these dominant discourses. So that was a lot of talking. Jennifer.
So in addition to Foucault as kind of a theoretical grounding for this type of discussion, Paulo Freire and Gloria Anzaldúa are a couple of additional kind of big hitters when it comes to taking the discourse of power and looking at language and identity. So Paulo Freire, and these are two scholars that anyone sort of with a background in like English studies or education or communications, like you've likely encountered these scholars. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian scholar who actually spent a a lot of his career in the Boston area, at Boston area institutions, which is really fun. And he's most famous for his book entitled Pedagogy of the Oppressed. This quote is from another one of his books, Literacy, Reading the Word in the World. But in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he sort of interrogates traditional models of education. And he labels the traditional model of education as the banking concept, where teacher is authority and deposits knowledge, whatever that content is, into the receptacle student. So it's a power dynamic, it's a one-way street. And he interrogates this to offer kind of alternatives, what he calls like problem posing education, a more dialogic approach, inquiry-based approach, teacher partnering with student, which frankly sounds a lot like some of the values that we try to promote at Regis in terms of our pedagogies. In Language and Identity, Farah talks about how a child learns to sort of name the world, and identity and language are therefore intertwined. And Zaldua does something similar. So Frere at one point says the dominant class, which has the power to define, profile, and describe the world, begins to pronounce that the speech habits of the subordinate groups are a corruption, a bastardization of the dominant discourse. A language is developed to the degree that it reaches a certain stability in a particular area, and to the extent that it is used in the comprehension and expression of the world by the groups that speak it. And I'll come back to this idea in a few minutes when I move on to the next slide, because he's interrogating this myth of standard English. And Zaldua, for her part, defines herself as a lesbian feminist Chicana and someone who grew up speaking kind of multiple languages and feeling like as she was going through graduate school and pursuing a doctorate, that she was sort of constantly being kind of funneled and forced into producing content according to the dominant discourse. And similar to Frere, talks about how, you know, if you're going to sort of try and shape my language and my discourse, you are impacting my actual identity. That is the power that you have there. So ethnic identity is twin skin to linguistic identity. I am my language. Until I can take pride in my language, I cannot take pride in myself. As long as I have to accommodate the English speaker, rather than having them accommodate me, my tongue will be illegitimate. And this is, her perspective is an interesting one to sort of bear in mind as educators, particularly when we're in speaking intensive or writing intensive settings, and we think about sort of what this partnership is between teacher and student and what we expect in terms of discourse. And we can go to the next slide. So I'll talk for just a couple of minutes about the evolution of literacy and the myth of standard English. This year's Common Read at Regis is Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, in which he looks at his childhood growing up in apartheid era South Africa. It's a fascinating book. It's interesting to read and to talk about. And so the students at Regis, all the first year students are in the middle of kind of reading this and analyzing it. And Noah talks about language as both a barrier and a bridge, that it brings with it identity and culture, or at least the perception of it. A shared language says we're the same, and a language barrier says we're different. And the architects of apartheid understood this. And he goes into how even though Black people in South Africa were the majority and white people were the minority, the white minority was able to sort of maintain power through this division based on language and tribal associations. So because different groups of Black people spoke different languages, the white minority was able to capitalize on this and prevent unification, and therefore sort of have this architecture to apartheid. In our first year writing classes, we talk about literacies plural and how our concept of literacy and language has evolved over time. So for example, going back, and this is a Western-centric example, by the way, but going back sort of in time, we had a Bible that was not accessible to the common person. It was the privilege and power of priesthood to sort of have access to scripture and therefore be that conduit between a person and God. Once the Bible was translated into the vernacular, all of a sudden we had someone's ability to access scripture and to access God, and literacy kind of was promoted by way of Bible translation. Then we get to a kind of post-medieval Renaissance era where if someone wanted to petition the government, they needed a basic standard of literacy, which involved being able to sign one's name. And if you could not sign your name, then you could not adequately submit a petition to government. And so there's this kind of historical trend to maintain power or to funnel power through someone's sort of access to literacy, however that was being sort of defined at the time. One of the questions I raised to our students at the beginning of our classes is, how do we define literacy now? Is it if we do not have access to email, if we do not have access to the internet, if we don't have exposure to these things, does that mean we're sort of fully literate in today's society? So there's an assumption that digital literacies, information literacies are a part of how we tend to define literacy now. And ultimately, there is a tension between this myth of standard English, which is the creation of people in power, versus standardized Englishes, which is a concept of just sets of rules, which leads us to discourse community. So this is a concept that sort of grows out of all of that scholarship around like Foucault and Freire and Anzaldúa, and we get this term like discourse community, where we look at discourse, which is the use of language, and community, which is just a group that's defined by any kind of shared values or purpose. And so this gets back to the first rhetorical question, how many languages do you speak? That's a question that I ask our students. And then I talk about what a discourse community is and how we make rhetorical choices based on the community that we're in, because there's a shared value and a shared purpose. So an example would be the discourse community of a soccer team, the discourse community of brain surgeons and the way they talk to each other and use language in a very exclusive way, the discourse community of a religious congregation and the scriptures that they share and the terms that they use also sort of are exclusive to that community. And we can move on.
So we're going to do a little, the animation's not working on the slide, so forgive me. Talk through quickly some examples of some of the concepts we're talking about, but more so with individual identity terms. I know there is some, there's definitely some debate and with literacy critical theorists around the notion of labeling something an identity marker and what that means. And we can deconstruct the power of putting a label on something. But when we're endeavoring to be more inclusive in our language, it's important to recognize that these terminologies and that we use to refer to minoritized populations, how they came about and what they mean, so we can deconstruct them and be more inclusive moving forward. The first is around minority versus minoritized. It doesn't come up. So the first word, minority, is, the concept minority, I'm sure you've seen it all the time, minority student. And it's the language that's used in laws, it's in data collection reporting, and under URM, underrepresented minority. But we have to pause and think about why the dominant group would label others as minority. And if we think about and deconstruct that idea of a minority and what that means in a time and place in history, it leaves the assumption that you're relieving the dominant group of responsibility for the conditions of minoritized people. It also makes those who are labeled as minority feel as though they are few. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So by labeling something minority, people perceive themselves as one of very few, whereas in reality, those who are labeled as minority are actually in the global majority. Whereas if we use a term like minoritized, that recognize the systemic inequalities and oppression and marginalization that places the individual into a minority status rather than their own characteristics. So by changing it from a noun to a verb, we're recognizing it as a condition as opposed to a state of being. And again, it also reflects that the labeled minorities are those in the global majority. Another quick example of that is the difference between handicapped, which we also see in our laws and our policies. And it is derived from a hand and cap game. And it also comes from a time where, it comes from a time where people labeled as handicap were seen as deviant from punishment from God, or deviant in some way and capable of being institutionalized and labeled as other. Whereas we think about it as accessible, we're changing that construction around the responsibilities on us to make more accessible and inclusive spaces. Homophobia versus heterosexism. So this is a newer one. The suffix phobia comes from fear of. And so when we're thinking critically about this term, words like homophobia or Islamophobia are pretty recognizable, but the problem with phobia is it labels the idea that there's people, first of all, that actually have phobias or real diagnosed anxiety disorders with experiences. What we're not labeling here is the fear of. What we're labeling here is it's not a mental illness, it's something different than that. So by removing the phobia and focusing again on the power structures and calling it heterosexism, we're changing that construct. Transgendered, another one, it suggests that being trans is something that happens to someone as opposed to identity someone is born with. So it's not a verb, it's a noun in that case. I will also note today is International Pronouns Day. So when we talk about normalizing discourses around sharing our pronouns, that is deconstructing the discourses of the power structures and sort of helping reframe that power discourse in order to normalize the fact that one cannot assume gender identity from gender expression or by looking at someone. That is also construction and change in our discourse by combating that power structure and normalizing the idea that we can't assume by looking at someone at all. And the other animation doesn't work as well. I tested these too, Jennifer, but do you want to give your example?
Yeah, I can give, so I've a kind of phrased example to share of when we maybe are coming from a place of that myth of standard English. So if someone says, you can't tell me anything, we tend to, this sort of dominant discourse, that myth of standard English, sees that as a correct statement. You can't tell me anything. Versus if someone says, you can't tell me nothing. And our impulse, if we're coming from that sort of dominant place of quote unquote standard English, is to say, well, the you can't tell me nothing is incorrect because we feel like we want to avoid redundancy when it comes to negation. That's one of those sort of standard English rules. However, there's also a tendency for the sort of keepers of the dominant discourse or this myth of standard English to kind of flip back around and say things like, no, you can't do that. That's generally an accepted way of speaking, even though that's breaking one's own rule if we're sort of abiding by the dominant discourse. And the other sort of point to make here is that if someone, there's this distinction between abiding by kind of rules of the myth of standard English versus communication, and thinking about, has someone communicated in a way that you understand? Most of us, if someone says, you can't tell me nothing, we actually understand like what that means. The point has been communicated.
All right, so we're gonna turn it to the group in a sec. Let me just, sorry, don't mind me. The next up, this is a great video. I will share these slides with you, but this is Loretta Ross. If you don't know, it's great, but she's essentially telling us about the origin of the term women of color as an identity marker and how that came about as a political tool. So when we're talking about inclusive language and terms to use to refer to marginalized populations, we also, in recognizing it as both an expression of and a reaction to power and the power of self-definition, bound in a time and place and a space in history. She's talking about how adopting the term women of color became a political necessity in order to build larger coalitions in order to advance an agenda that started as the Black Women's Agenda. But I'll send you this link. Let's quickly go through what you can do, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So first of all, we can learn new things. This is I love this example because people used to say groovy, and we all probably know what that means. And now these symbols, which if we weren't socialized into some sort of discursive community that allowed us to understand this, but now we do. So to Jennifer's point, I mean, we learn different tools to communicate and understand with each other. And now things like LOL and OMG become part of our communication, regular forms of communication.
So I'll talk a little bit about what we mean by rhetorical choices and listening. So in our first year kind of writing classes, we deliberately kind of move through different genres of reading and writing. And we start with our first year students coming in. The very first thing that we sort of look at in terms of a genre is the personal narrative and writing a personal narrative. And the reason for that is to, number one, kind of embrace voice and have some more sort of creative space there for our students. It's a chance for us to sort of learn who our students are and to try and kind of back off from that impulse to impose the dominant discourse. So we right away try and start out from a more dialogic kind of perspective. But then we do move into textual analysis where we're analyzing text and how text, whether it's written text or oral text, visual text, what the different elements of that are, how they work together to make meaning. And we move into other genres like crafting and argument. The point being that we want to be sort of transparent around the rhetorical choices we're making. So based on the purpose and the audience, whether it's a tweet to a certain group of people, or it's a cover letter to a prospective employer, or it's an op-ed piece that we're writing for some publication, it's all about purpose and audience. So rather than having a blanket sort of imposition of this myth of standard English, it's a conversation around, okay, what are the choices that we're making as a writer and speaker based on my purpose and audience in this particular context. And listening, I just have this as a basic thing that I try and remember to do as much as I can when I'm listening to other people in conversation.
Always a good tool. The other one I have here, just check your assumptions. As we discussed, the assumptions that we have about how we talk to and refer to one another are steeped in our socialization and that dominant culture norms. So, this is almost asking for that pause moment or to check in with yourself about why am I making this choice? about a particular term or a particular phrase, or even whether or not to critique a particular piece of writing in a certain way, reflect on some of the dominant cultural discourses that are informing those, some of the systems of oppression that have been socialized within us, and check in with yourself. Um, Commit to continued learning, of course. I mean, language is a living, breathing thing that is always evolving, always changing. So we need to show interest in the lives of others. We're often segregated from those who are different from us because of the system that in which we live, and so we need to make those intentional actions to show interest in the lives of others who are different than us, and to create those inclusive and identity affirming communities. When in doubt, ask. The best way to know how someone would like to be addressed is by asking them to just ask, but also be mindful that one person's preference is not necessarily universal to everyone who shares their identity. So that asking, whether it be how should I refer to you, whether it be pronouns, whether it be identities, I want to refer to your racial ethnic identity in this research paper, what would you like me to use? Those are the things that should be defined by the person to which you're referring. And then when you become aware of, when you learn something new, change your language. We do all have the right to say whatever we want, but in this world, but there are consequences for what we say. So when we are committed to building inclusive and equitable spaces, when we're committing ourselves to continued learning and growth, when we are making sure that everyone who comes to us feels heard, seen, and like they belong, then we need to be able to learn from our mistakes, adopt new language, and not stay wedded into what we've always been socialized to believe to be true. That's my story. I'm sticking to it. We have some sources. I'll add some more. I have a shared folder for you. I'll put the link in the chat. But now we want to open it up for questions and discussion, whether related to what we just shared or not. But I'm going to pause the recording so we can have an open discussion. Thanks.